Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the place where we turn massive stacks of challenging source material into crystal clear insights.
Yeah, and today we are definitely undertaking a unique intellectual expedition.
We are. It's a philosophical journey back to Finland, 1895, to immerse ourselves in the radical and, really uncompromising writings of the social critic, novelist, and ethical thinker Arvid Järnefelt.
And, this is not just some historical exercise. This collection of smaller writings, they were often published as tracts. You have things like Atheism, which is atheist, Kostojar and Geistes, Revenge and Punishment.
And Isenat ja Torperet, landlords and crofters.
Exactly. And together they present this unified, almost devastating critique of the late 19th century world. Järnefelt is really tackling the very foundations of Western civilization head on.
The big questions.
The biggest.
Yeah.
What is God when scientific materialism is triumphant? What does justice even mean when ancient passions are codified into state law? And maybe most pointedly, what is the moral responsibility of the educated classes in a world defined by this stark agricultural inequality?
So our mission today is very specific. We're performing a deep dive into this paradoxical notion that absolute intellectual honesty, the kind of rigor that leads one to atheism, becomes almost unexpectedly the only reliable pathway to a more profound, more internalized, and really radical spirituality. And then once we've established that internal spiritual authority, we're going to track how Järnefelt uses it to fundamentally critique and dismantle these external systems of law, punishment, and social hierarchy.
It's really a journey of philosophical relocation. I like that phrase. The sources argue for a complete shift.
A shift away from what?
Away from reliance on external sources of truth. So that could be historical narrative, religious rituals, legal codes, all these things that are, inherently corruptible.
And a shift towards what?
Towards an internal authority. This internal source is the conscience, or what Järnefelt calls the parempi mine, the better self.
So our deep dive is essentially an exploration of what happens when you apply this absolute, unblinking intellectual honesty to everything.
Everything, including the most sacred and entrenched human institutions. It's a wild ride.
Okay, let's start right where Järnefelt does in that pamphlet, Atheism. He begins with a pretty provocative definition of atheism itself.
Yeah, it's not what you'd think. He suggests that the common atheist of 1895 is often someone who believed very deeply in a very specific, almost managerial God.
An external God.
Completely external God. And they simply stopped believing when that specific conception was, scientifically discredited.
So the problem was that they failed to realize any other kind of God could possibly exist?
Exactly. It's a brilliant diagnosis of that whole, late Victorian spiritual malaise. He outlines this common journey of the era. He calls it the journey of the parson's son.
Sure.
So this young man, he's raised hearing these very abstract explanations of a creator and an all-powerful, omnipresent personality who controls, the smallest details of the cosmos.
The fall of a sand grain, the rotation of the planets, all of it.
All of it. It's a vast, complicated, and frankly often contradictory theology.
And then he leaves the personage and he enters the crucible of the modern university, specifically medicine or science.
That's the turning point. He moves from that abstract world of sermonic explanation into the concrete empirical environment of the laboratory.
Right.
And suddenly, the microscopic lenses, the gleaming brass instruments, the precise cylinders, these tools, they become his new keys to knowledge and light.
The instruments themselves become the source of authority.
They inspire an almost religious pride, and it completely displaces the old faith. I love how the source captures the psychological shift here.
It's not just about the facts, is it? It's about pride.
It's totally about pride. The young scientist develops this sense of intrinsic superiority. It's like, only those who see through this microscope can know anything. Don't let those who haven't looked through it speak.
He confuses the instrument of knowledge with knowledge itself.
He does. And look, this intellectual triumph is, in a way, fully justified by the discoveries being made at the time.
Sure.
The scientific perspective asserts that everything, from the inner working of a single cell all the way up to the grand order of the cosmos, is governed by these comprehensible, predictable, immutable natural laws.
Which means the notion of a divine personality continually interfering, arbitrarily managing daily events.
It becomes utterly superfluous,
Yeah.
and frankly, it starts to seem intellectually sloppy.
He uses that specific example of cosmology to really drive the point home. The parson's son had been told by old nurses that the stars were just pinholes poked through the heavenly ceiling, right? So people could glimpse paradise.
But the telescope tells a very different story.
A much less romantic one.
A much less romantic one, yeah. It reveals these massive celestial bodies, utterly impersonal, just rotating, cooling, burning, and obeying the same gravitational and thermal laws that govern processes right here on Earth.
So the universe is governed by laws that are completely intelligible to human reason.
Exactly. And so there's just no longer any need for that creator who's supposedly labored for 6 days and then rested on the seventh.
Wow.
The old creation myths, Adam formed from clay, Eve from a rib.
They get replaced by the slow, verifiable process of natural selection and development from lower life form.
Which leads to the ultimate atheistic conclusion, reached with perfect rational rigor. Nowhere in the vastness of the universe, nowhere under the sharp scrutiny of the microscope, is there anything that is foreign to or contradicts human reason.
Everything is lawful.
Everything is lawful. And so if God, as defined by the church, requires contradiction and mystery to exist, well,
Then God is finished.
God is finished. But
Yeah.
here is the profound pivot in the story.
Yeah.
This is the turning point. This triumph of reason, it doesn't lead to liberation.
No, it leads to what the writer calls a chilling effect on the soul, a profound spiritual coldness.
Yes. The source shares a personal timeline, saying that as his factual knowledge expanded, his belief in the old myths just disintegrated. He stopped believing in that external God, but eventually he reached a point of overwhelming existential need for God.
A spiritual hunger that reason itself cannot satisfy.
Precisely. He felt this need so strongly that he actually considered committing violence to his reason, just to recover some sense of the sacred or the divine.
So his rational mind had proven the external God impossible, but that deep internal need for meaning, for connection to something ultimate, it remained, and it was unbearable.
It was unbearable. So how does he resolve this tension without betraying the intellectual honesty that his scientific training demands?
He finds the answer, and this is so unexpected, in a rational reinterpretation of Christ's teachings. He finds the concept of the internal God.
This is the critical shift,
Yeah.
because the concept of the internal God immediately bypasses all the scientific traps that destroyed the old faith.
Oh,
Well, the old God, the hacker and governor of heaven and earth, his attributes like omnipotence and omnipresence were spatial. They were out there, and so they were prone to disintegration under empirical scrutiny. But this new concept is non-spatial.
so the internal God concept avoids the whole problem of having to prove an external personal manager of events.
Right. Instead, this God speaks in one's own consciousness. It's closer than anything else we can perceive. The sources suggest that we often mistake this voice for our own better self, or, most commonly, our conscience.
And Järnefelt argues that the true teaching is that this conscience, which we often marginalize or just ignore in the noise of daily life,
Is the Father's voice. It's the spark of the infinite. And it's shared by all people because it originates from a common shared life source. And so the moral imperative, what he calls the Son's life, is simply to live in constant service and obedience to the ethical demands of this internal voice.
But wait, that sounds like faith. How does he protect this new internal concept from the exact same scientific scrutiny that destroyed the external God? Isn't this just, spiritual wish fulfillment?
But that's the beautiful philosophical move here. The writer argues that this internal view doesn't fight reason. It completes it.
Okay.
It's not about abandoning scientific logic. It's about recognizing the necessary highest truth for that logic to even function. He uses that analogy of the astronomer to explain this necessary rational faith.
Okay, yeah, let's slow down on the astronomer analogy because this feels like the keystone.
It is. So when an astronomer studies the cosmos, they must ultimately accept the concept of the infinity of space.
Right.
This is a truth that's necessary for rational calculation. If space is finite, the entire system of physics and cosmology just collapses into contradiction.
It's utterly impossible to empirically prove the infinity of space.
Exactly. No telescope can reach the edge of all things to confirm there is no edge. You can't do it.
So the astronomer accepts the infinity of space as the highest rational truth. It's an object of faith, but it's a faith that reason itself demands in order for the whole system to remain logical and continuous.
Precisely. And Järnefelt draws the parallel. Recognizing the living spirit or conscience as originating from a common infinite source, the Father, is necessary for a truly logical and continuous way of thinking about morality in existence.
I see. So if the ethical impulse in your conscience is just some random biological accident, then all subsequent moral reasoning is just arbitrary.
Right. To make ethical life rational and continuous, you have to posit its source as infinite and unified.
It functions as the light by which all other moral truths are illuminated, but it can't be illuminated by anything higher than itself. It's the starting axiom for moral truth.
And that acceptance, he notes, it doesn't lead to the arrogance of the scientist who looks down on others for not seeing through his special lens.
No, it leads to complete humility and even more a change of life.
Exactly. The person realizes their reason is merely an instrument, just a lens, to perceive this shared internal light. It's not the end destination.
The ultimate irony here is this powerful synthesis. The very scientific rigor that chased the traditional external God out of the distant stars ends up confirming that the true God must be found where human reason resides inside the conscience.
And that becomes the foundation upon which he builds his entire social critique.
All right, so now that the conscience is established as the absolute authority, Järnefelt immediately turns his critical gaze toward established religious practice. This is in uskojajarki, or faith and reason.
And the critique really targets that common spiritual advice that the rational seeker often gets.
Don't trust your reason, just believe.
Just believe. And this advice is often delivered by a believer who has genuinely found peace and joy. They insist that the skeptic must achieve that peace by simply stopping the intellectual effort, by accepting the faith blindly, cheerfully, like a child.
For the person committed to intellectual honesty, though, this creates an immediate, severe crisis.
A total crisis. The skeptical seeker, he tries to comply. He reads the holy books, he tries to adopt the mindset, but his rational mind just instantly identifies contradictions, absurdities, historical inconsistencies.
So every intellectual structure he tries to build just collapses instantly.
It does, because it requires abandoning the very tool reason that he uses to verify all other forms of truth. He realizes he can't just pretend to be happy or achieve peace through blind acceptance.
The effort results in this kind of internal dissonance where he's told that reality is a rock and the dream is distance.
And living that double life, trying to enforce an unlived ideal, it just leads to profound unhappiness.
This skepticism leads to a really fascinating psychological critique, which is laid out in a letter from the skeptical friend in the source. The friend describes interacting with an extreme Christian who is, undeniably pure, self-sacrificing, and radiates this non-selfish joy.
And the initial conclusion for many observers would be, this has to be it. This must be the miraculous supernatural manifestation of God's external power.
But the skeptic rejects that leap of faith.
He completely rejects it and proposes a purely psychological explanation. The joy, the purity, the self-sacrifice. He argues these are simply the natural, entirely predictable consequences of consistently choosing the path of goodness.
So they're not signs of a supernatural, external God's miraculous power.
No. They are the signs of a disciplined, internally honest human spirit.
This is a radical recentering of power, isn't it? I mean, if piety and joy are just the result of ethical choices and mental discipline, then the external clergy, the doctrine, the entire institutional structure,
They lose their claim to channeling some unique, divine, supernatural power.
it takes the magic out of it.
Absolutely. The writer suggests that institutional religion fears reason precisely because reason threatens to reveal all these so-called religious secrets as natural psychological phenomena. The fear is that this revelation would destroy the necessary illusion of miraculous power that gives the external church its authority.
And the friend shares this one anecdote that just crystallizes the whole revelation for him. He describes his own mental technique for avoiding temptation.
Right. Instead of engaging in this great, agonizing internal battle every time he's tempted.
He just immediately adopts an unfeeling, settled stance. He treats the issue as already decided, and he just walks past it as if it were nothing.
And he explains this mental tactic to the believer.
Who is stunned. The believer exclaims, "But that precisely is God's power. You have found the great secret of the believer's life."
And that is the defining aha moment. The skeptic realizes, wait a minute, that's what they call God's power.
This natural mental tactic for impulse control and discipline achieved through rational effort is then just reframed by the church as divine intervention.
Exactly. And this realization leads him to a conclusion. If religious phenomena can be explained entirely through internal, psychological, and ethical laws, then the external faith built on the supernatural interpretation is, quote, false, founded upon error.
And so he concludes that the only escape from spiritual unhappiness is to return to honest intellectual effort, to use reason as the keenest eye of the soul.
The sources then analyze this curious paradox of prayer. The skeptic admitted that they prayed despite not believing.
Why?
They did it because they desperately wanted to believe. And they noticed that this practice often led to a palpable shift in mood. Sometimes it even resulted in finding what they prayed for.
Which momentarily strengthened that external God concept.
For a moment, yeah. Until the rational mind re-engaged and broke the illusion.
So the question remains, why did prayer work even when it was misdirected?
Järnefelt explains the beneficial effect from an internal standpoint. Sincere prayer, he defines it as an honest purification of the heart. It's an intense, focused effort to become childlike and self-honest about one's moral state and needs.
And critically, it doesn't matter who the upper realm person or the external recipient is.
Not at all. If the prayer is a sincere expression of desire for truth and freedom from falsehood, the person aligns their consciousness with the true living God who speaks in the heart.
So the act of self-purification is what brings the result, not the external address.
Exactly. But this brings us back to the central challenge, right? How do you bridge that gap between reason and faith without asking the rational mind to commit intellectual suicide? How do you move beyond the intellectual rock?
And the writer tackles that close your eyes approach using this vivid analogy of the forest.
Yeah, it's a great one. Imagine you're standing in a thicket. You see a great pale gray rock blocking the path. It is undeniably a rock.
Okay.
And someone, a well-meaning believer, comes along and tells you to close your eyes and just believe that this rock is actually an opening onto a beautiful, hazy distance.
But if you close your eyes, you just see darkness, and when you open them,
The rock is still there. Blind belief accomplishes nothing but dissonance.
the reality of true spiritual awakening is far more demanding. True faith is not blindness, it's the culmination of the keenest possible sight.
Yes. It happens when the believer, using their sharpened reason, perceives a fine, thin line on the rock's surface, a subtle detail that the ordinary eye misses.
And that detail is the key that suddenly resolves the mystery and reveals the vast, desired opening beyond.
Faith follows the sight of reason. It doesn't precede it.
This analogy is just so vital because it redefines the role of the seeker. Our task isn't to tell others to stop thinking.
No, it is to encourage them to sharpen their sight, to push their reason to its absolute limit, seeking that critical resolving detail. Järnefelt's work demands that spiritual truth must be put into a form that is comprehensible to reason, thus making the path to faith itself perfectly rational.
Okay, so with the conscience now firmly established as the highest moral authority, Järnefelt immediately applies that internal moral compass to society's most entrenched external institution, the system of law and punishment.
This is in the work Costo Jarangestus, or Revenge and Punishment. And this section is just a devastating genealogical critique of state power.
It is. The sources state with, chilling clarity that punishment, Rengestus, is nothing more than the performance of private revenge or costo.
The textbook definition of state punishment, pain or suffering inflicted for wrongdoing is, he argues, philosophically and practically identical to the definition of vengeance.
He analyzes the social mechanics of revenge. He says it's certainly driven by hatred, but the act itself requires public approval to transition from just a mere passion to accepted justice.
Right, the avenger needs validation. They seek impartial parties, people outside the conflict, to confirm that their hatred and the resulting act of vengeance are understandable and thus acceptable.
So the goal is not just to inflict pain, but to gain that public sense of being right.
And this specific need for validation, this seeking of impartial confirmation, is the crucial seed from which early legal systems grew.
He says we often misunderstand the classic Italian principle, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
We do. We see it as harsh. But if that was the origin of law, we have to ask why.
Right. Why do we see it as harsh?
Because we forget its original context. The Italian principle was initially introduced not as a punitive measure, but as an early limit on vengeance.
The limit.
Yes. Before this rule, the custom was often that a kin group might retaliate against an injury by inflicting massive, disproportionate harm, which would lead to unending blood feuds.
So an eye for an eye was actually a rule of moderation.
It meant you cannot take two eyes for one eye. It was a step toward limiting retribution, not escalating it.
Okay, so from there we track the transition from kin group revenge, which was a sacred religious duty of the tribe, often passed down as an inherited obligation to state law.
And the rising social spirit, particularly the promise of broader peace and love offered by Christianity and the concept of the kingdom, directly challenges those old gods of kin group vengeance.
This is where politics and power intersect with morality.
Absolutely. Kings, recognizing that continuous blood feuds destabilize their domains, gradually monopolize the right to vengeance. They claim the exclusive right to punish in order to preserve public peace and, consolidate their power.
And this transition in the Swedish legal tradition, which influenced Finland, was symbolized by the peace oath of the king, the konungsedsur.
Yes, where the monarch guaranteed peace and took the burden of vengeance away from the individual.
But as the state institutionalized this monopoly, punishment became the key tool for controlling the ruled.
Right. And the Mosaic Law, containing that now compulsory Italian principle, was adopted and reinterpreted not as a limit anymore, but as divine will. This transforms law from a mechanism for mediation and settlement into a definitive mechanism for retribution.
And this, Järnefelt says, is the point where philosophy steps in and commits its tremendous error.
Tremendous error. Philosophers looked at this established historical fact that states punish and just assumed it must be morally necessary. And they then spent centuries trying to justify a practice that originated in primitive passion.
Let's quickly review the philosophical attempts to justify state punishment, because he just systematically dismantles them. First, you've got the deterrence theory.
Right. Deterrence posits that punishment is meant to frighten future criminals, to teach the rest of society a lesson. This led, inevitably, to increasingly cruel and public executions.
It was spectacle.
It was spectacle designed to terrorize the raw, ignorant, common people. Järnefelt argues this fundamentally violates the intrinsic personal worth of the convicted person. You're treating them merely as a means to a social end.
And he says for those who are already morally compromised, severe punishment only teaches them to be more cunning, not more moral.
Exactly. Moral character, not fear, is what prevents most crime.
Okay, so next up is the self-defense theory.
This theory claims that punishment is necessary for society's self-defense, like warding off an enemy. But this fails on multiple levels.
First, punishment happens after the crime has already been committed.
Right. And second, recidivism rates demonstrate that it utterly fails to prevent future crimes. If protection is the only goal, Järnefelt suggests, simple containment like quarantining the sick is better, more honest, and doesn't require the unnecessary infliction of pain in the name of retribution.
Let's dig into that quarantine concept a bit more. If the goal is purely protection, what does replacing the punitive model with quarantining the sick practically entail? I mean, what does that look like?
Well, it forces society to acknowledge the criminal act as a social illness or a moral deficiency that requires containment and potential cure, rather than a debt that requires painful repayment.
So it's about a change in mindset.
It's a fundamental change. The moment you introduce pain or suffering beyond what is strictly necessary for containment, you reintroduce the core element of vengeance. Containment is based on utility and future safety. Punishment is based on settling an old score.
And Järnefelt's argument is that the modern system can't honestly claim pure self-defense because it insists on the pain, on the suffering, on the vengeance, even when that pain doesn't contribute to future safety.
Precisely. Which leads to the final category, the absolute theories, like those from Kant and Hegel.
Now, these are the most intellectually robust theories.
They are, because they avoid the shaky ground of utility. They don't care if punishment reforms or deters anyone. They just posit that punishment is a pure moral necessity simply because a crime occurred.
It must be avenged or negated to restore the abstract principle of justice.
Right. Hegel described it almost mathematically. An injustice is a minus, so it must be negated by an equal negation, another, minus the punishment, to restore the positive balance of justice.
But wait, isn't Hegel's concept of negating an injustice far more sophisticated than just simple private revenge? Is Järnefelt just dismissing one of philosophy's wisest responses because it echoes something primitive?
And that's the intellectual friction we need to explore. Järnefelt's point is that while it is sophisticated, the absolute theory still cannot answer the essential question. What gives society the absolute moral right to mete out this negation? They are forced to fall back on the idea that society inherits this right from some divine or objective moral imperative. And Järnefelt just traces this lineage back through the centuries, arguing that the divine imperative is merely the institutionalized echo of the ancient human passionate need for vengeance.
So when philosophers claim punishment is just retribution, they're just intellectualizing the primitive question. Is this act of vengeance understandable and acceptable to an impartial judge?
Exactly. So whether the theory is crude, like deterrence, or refined, like absolute necessity, it always traces back to the institutionalization of long-forgotten passion and self-interest.
And the source suggests the modern conscience, thanks largely to the state having taken away the duty of private revenge, has actually evolved past the need for personal retribution.
It has. The internal conscience is now ready to forgive and forget the offense.
So if the only philosophical justification for state punishment is that private vengeance is justified, and our internal conscience teaches us forgiveness and forgetting,
Then the entire punitive system, the courts, the jails, the whole apparatus, is morally obsolete.
which brings us to the radical call to action. Järnefelt is not interested in gradual legislative reform.
Not at all. He argues that if the system is based on obsolete revenge, you must stop participating entirely.
If you are a judge, a prosecutor, or a jailer, your moral duty is clear. Quit.
And this absolute internal moral action, driven by the individual conscience, is the only way for the system to change. It's like water flooding a vessel from the inside out.
That's a massive conclusion for the justice system. Now let's track how this same radical internal critique, this rejection of all external compliance that contradicts the conscience, is applied to other societal structures.
Okay, so we move first into two systems of external control, religious ritual, and then economic hierarchy. The transition is philosophical.
External compliance, whether it's ritual or law, is the enemy of internal truth.
That's the through line. We begin with two key rituals, baptism or kost, and the Lord's Supper, represented by siomenen, or eating.
Right. Regarding baptism, specifically infant baptism, the writer argues it runs entirely contrary to Christ's central teaching that the kingdom of God is within.
It's criticized as a form of works of the law, kind of like Jewish circumcision. It's an external ritual that sets an arbitrary condition for salvation.
And it implies an external God who demands compliance with rules and rituals, rather than an internal God who demands truth and honesty from the heart.
And the source material takes a deep, critical look at the biblical text, specifically John 3:5, where Jesus tells Nicodemus, "Unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God."
Mainstream theology interprets this as a command for ritual baptism.
But Järnefelt argues this is a literal misunderstanding, and the correction he offers is startling. It's highly academic.
What is it?
The source suggests that water, or vede, here refers not to ritual baptismal water, but to seminal fluid, the essence of fleshly biological generation. Yeah. This meaning is hinted at in other early Christian texts. And under this reading, John 3:5 means being born of flesh, the seminal fluid and spirit, the divine spark. It is not a ritual command at all.
It's a statement on the dual origin of human existence. We are born of the physical world and we possess the spiritual world.
Precisely. And this reframing completely removes the necessity of external ritual as a precondition for salvation. The kingdom of God is within, accessible to everyone because they possess that divine spirit from birth.
So if we insist on ritual baptism as a necessary precursor, Järnefelt says, we're just falling back into the old misconception of God as a creator who demands compliance to external law rather than internal commitment.
The critique of external compliance then continues with the metaphor of eating, or siomenen, which Järnefelt uses as the key analogy for spiritual life and discipline.
Jesus taught that true food is doing the will of the Father. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he rejected prioritizing physical needs, stating, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God."
Right. And the sources argue that the physical body, the liha, and blood are not what sustain eternal life. Rather, the fleshly life, the body, its appetites, its desires, is meant to be consumed and sacrificed in service of the Spirit.
That constant sacrifice of self-interest for the higher ethical calling is the true food for the spiritual life.
It is. And this understanding provides a radical critique of the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, when it devolves into just a mere ritualistic consumption.
Paul had to address the Corinthians about this, right? Because their shared love feast, the agape, was already being degraded into gluttony and drunkenness.
An act of selfish consumption, entirely missing the point. The purpose of breaking bread and sharing the cup is not the literal ingestion of the divine essence.
No, it's to remember the teacher's sacrifice and to resolve to use one's own body and life for sacrificial service, not for gluttonous enjoyment.
And to partake without internalizing that meaning, that the body is broken and given for others, is, the source suggests, to eat and drink to one's own ruin. The ritual is only a functional reminder of an internal commitment.
The philosophical consistency here is just striking. All systems of external compliance, God defined externally, justice defined externally, salvation defined by ritual, are susceptible to corruption the moment they replace the internal truth of the conscience.
And this philosophical consistency now allows Järnefelt to move his moral compass directly toward the material structures of power, specifically tackling the severe economic disparity in Finland during that era, the struggle between landlords and crofters, aisenet ja torperet.
In 1895 Finland, the agrarian question was, it was volatile. The vast majority of the population was tied to the land, and the social structures were rapidly disintegrating due to economic shifts. Land rights were central to political identity.
And this section uses the historical development of Finnish land law as a perfect case study in how power structures use abstract concepts like property rights to justify blatant exploitation.
So historically, the Swedish crown protected peasant farmers, the talonpojat from local lords establishing omistusoikeus, or inherited ownership as a fundamental protected law.
And this allowed for massive agricultural expansion. But as land became tremendously valuable, the landlords, the Isenet, sought a new legal framework.
They rejected the customary inherited rights that protected the farmer.
Completely. Instead, they adopted the harsh, ancient Roman definition of omistusoikeus, absolute mastery over the object, giving the owner the unquestioned right to change, use, destroy, or expel anyone from the land.
And the shift from customary tenure to written, short-term contract law was devastating for the crofters, the torporate.
Devastating. The crofters were tenant farmers who lived on the land, clearing and cultivating it, in return for labor owed to the landlord. They had previously relied on these tacit inherited rights.
Now, landlords insisted on short-term written contracts, often only binding for 10 years.
Which thereby abolished any security or inherited rights the crofter possessed.
The legal mechanisms put in place were designed to maximize the landlord's absolute mastery and minimize the crofter's recourse. What specific loopholes did the state create that reveal this institutionalized self-interest?
Well, the system focused on immediate, irreparable consequences. Eviction laws, even for vague tree texts like forest waste, cutting too much wood for fuel, or some minor negligence, were made exceptions to normal legal procedure.
Okay, so typically a court ruling would require an appeal period before it's executed.
Right. But eviction rulings went into effect immediately, regardless of appeal.
Meaning the poor crofter, who might have spent decades clearing stones, building barns, and cultivating the land, could be put on the roadside instantly, with his family, his entire livelihood just destroyed.
And his only recourse was to appeal in the highest court, a process that required immense money, time, and legal expertise that he absolutely did not possess.
It's a system designed for him to fail.
It is. And Järnefelt highlights the irony. The highly educated committee spent years upholding the sacredness of property rights, this abstract Roman concept, resulting in laws that did not protect justice, but guaranteed the wealthy absolute control.
And what was the moral consequence of the system?
The resulting law compelled the poor farmer to rely only on the goodness and trustworthiness of the landlord. His security was entirely dependent on the master's whim. The law forced him into a state of required subservience,
demanding he be humble and observant and stand capless before his master.
Yes, so the entire apparatus of external law, supposedly designed to maintain order, was exposed as a complex, abstract defense mechanism for institutionalized self-interest, replacing universal justice with the whim of the powerful. #outro.
We have completed this comprehensive deep dive into the radical Finnish philosophy of Arvid Järnefelt, and we've seen a powerful and profoundly consistent argument emerge, that the pursuit of truth begins with critical reasoning, stripping away superstition and external authority. That's the path of the atheist, which ultimately leads inward to the only reliable source of moral authority, the conscience.
And the overarching conflict is just so clear. External concepts, whether they are God defined by myth, law defined by vengeance, or property defined by absolute mastery, are destined for corruption because they contradict the fundamental ethical demands of that internal conscience. They are systems built to protect self-interest, just disguised as necessity or sacred duty.
The core message running through theology, law, and social structure is this conflict between the liberating power of internal truth and the oppressive, self-serving nature of external institutionalized power.
And that institutionalized power always seeks justification through abstract concepts, be it God's will or sacred law.
Järnefelt wraps this philosophy in a powerful image, doesn't he? The angel's journey.
He does. The angel finds freedom in obeying God's will, which Järnefelt defines simply as love and service. And when the angel observes the material world, they are struck by the stationary rock enduring the restless sea.
A symbol of enduring eternal truth amid the chaos of shifting human convention.
But the angel also observes the animal world, where beings love and serve only their immediate kin, their family, their tribe, their kind.
And the philosophical challenge for humanity is to move beyond that instinctual, narrow self-love to fulfilling the Father's will. Service and love for all people.
And this requires the spiritual discipline that transforms the physical body and its desires, the fleshly life, into food for the spirit. If the external systems of society, the punishment you inflict, the property structures you defend, the rituals you perform, if they're built on principles that clash with that internal universal love, they must eventually yield to the conscience.
The rock of truth, the conscience, will endure the shifting waves of human convention and institutionalized self-interest.
That's the idea.
So, what does this all mean for you? If, as our sources suggest, the historical progression of punishment and property law has been driven less by objective justice and more by the institutionalization of long-forgotten passion, the hatred of the avenger, the pride of the property owner, what structures in our modern life are we still obeying simply because we mistake their historical necessity for moral righteousness?
That's the question.
What modern systems are we still upholding today, standing capless and observant, that rely only on the goodness and trustworthiness of the powerful, rather than on universal, internally derived justice? That is the radical question Järnefelt asks you to answer in your own conscience.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
We'll see you next time.